à toutes et bonjour à tous. Merci d'être présents pour ce book club de ce dimanche après-midi. Merci de venir un dimanche pour réfléchir avec nous dans le cadre de cette dernière journée de notre semaine à l'école de l'Anthropocène. Je suis Michel Lussault, géographe, et je vais avoir le plaisir d'assurer ce book club en direct et en duplex, comme on disait jadis, de New York, où Eric Klinenberg est présent. Bonjour Eric.
Hello.
Et nous sommes très heureux de recevoir Eric Klinenberg, donc, qui est sociologue, qui est professeur à la New York University et qui dirige l'Institute for Public Knowledge dans cette même université. Cet institut est un institut qui est chargé en particulier de mener des recherches de sciences sociales dans une perspective qui consiste à considérer que le savoir des sciences sociales est un savoir essentiel au public et à la dynamique politique d'une société. Et Eric est invité aujourd'hui parce qu'il est l'auteur de ce livre très important, Heatwave, publié en 2002, il y a 20 ans déjà. Nous y reviendrons sans doute, Eric, sur le fait que ce livre a 20 ans en réalité, et qui, de notre point de vue, à l'école urbaine de Lyon, est un classique d'ores et déjà des études urbaines. Et ce livre nous a paru tellement important que nous avons, avec les éditions 205, décidé de réaliser sa traduction française, la première traduction française d'un livre d'Eric Klinenberg, qui a une œuvre importante, parce que c'est un sociologue important aux États-Unis. Et ce livre vient de paraître sous le titre Canicule, Chicago 1995, autopsie sociale d'une catastrophe. Et ce livre, nous sommes très heureux de pouvoir le rendre accessible au public français dans un contexte où la question des vagues de chaleur et des canicules devient une question de plus en plus importante, puisque nous sommes confrontés de manière régulière désormais chaque été à des épisodes de canicules qui pour certains sont des épisodes de canicules véritablement catastrophiques. Mais, et c'est la première question que je poserai à Eric, lorsque vous avez commencé, cher Eric, à mener ce travail, donc au siècle dernier, dans le cadre d'une thèse de doctorat réalisée à l'Université de Californie. Les canicules n'étaient pas véritablement des phénomènes particulièrement au centre de l'attention des sciences sociales, peut-être même d'ailleurs des sciences tout court, et encore moins au centre de l'attention des autorités et des grands publics. Alors, première question un peu simple, mais qui me paraît néanmoins nécessaire. Comment vous est venue l'idée de travailler sur cette canicule et comment petit à petit en êtes-vous venu aussi à considérer que ce que vous aviez à observer, la grande canicule de 95 en Chicago, ça n'était pas simplement une péripétie urbaine parmi d'autres, mais un événement emblématique d'une vulnérabilité urbaine à partir duquel on pouvait monter en généralité et peut-être commencer à penser un état de la situation urbaine contemporaine au-delà du cas d'espèce de Chicago.
Yes, well, first of all, let me say what an honor it is to be here with you this morning. For me, it's morning in New York City, and how nice it is for me to be virtually in Lyon today. It's such a thrill for me to see this book in French, and I want to express my appreciation to you, Michel, and your colleagues in Lyon for bringing it out in the French language. It's very exciting. And you should know also that the origins of this book are a little bit French too. I was actually living in France in the summer of 1995 when the heat wave arrived in Chicago. And I grew up in Chicago. It's a city I think about a lot. It's, of course, the capital of urban sociology. And in that, it also has a connection with Lyon, which is a great center for urban sociology. And when I first read in the newspaper that hundreds of people were dying every day in Chicago from something like the heat, to be honest, I didn't really understand what was happening. It didn't really make sense because you know, the United States is a very affluent society. Most people have air conditioning, you know, much more than in France. Chicago prides itself on being a city of neighborhoods and strong communities. And my first reaction was something is wrong that I don't understand. And then I kept following the story. There were more people dying every day, it seemed. And it occurred to me that what was happening was fundamentally about the city of Chicago and the way Chicago works, as much as it was about the heat. And so my first thought was, this is a puzzle. There's a puzzle here that's about how the city got so hot, but also how people in the city became so vulnerable, so isolated. What was shocking about the deaths from a sociological perspective is not just that there were a lot of them, but also that so many people died alone. They were isolated, old, and so many people died in some places and not others. And so, you know, when you're a sociologist and you study the city, the first thing you do is you draw a map. You make a map, and I made a map to see where people died. And some things on the map were really obvious because, you know, it's not very interesting scientifically to know that, you know, the poor neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, segregated neighborhoods suffer the most. It's politically very important to say that, but scientifically, that's not so interesting. It's predictable. But then I noticed that there were all kinds of surprises on the map too. And I wanted to understand the surprises. And so in the beginning, Michelle, the heat wave was really a diagnostic tool for me to understand the city. And I went to do research, but in time, what happened is I learned that the climate and the weather, the heat itself, was as sociologically interesting as the city. And so for the last 20 years, what's happened is that this book has become in a way more relevant every year. You know, it's strange. It's the opposite of what usually happens, but it keeps becoming more urgent. And so, in fact, I've never been able to escape this project.
Oui, je dois dire aux lecteurs français qui découvrent ce livre, puisqu'il a paru simplement depuis quelques jours en France, qu'on peut considérer que votre livre, Eric, est le premier livre de sciences sociales vraiment à aborder le climat et la canicule comme un fait social, ce que j'appellerais un fait anthropocène total, et d'essayer de comprendre l'interaction subtile entre le fait climatique et le fait urbain, sans essayer de trouver des rapports de détermination simples. C'est-à-dire votre livre est une enquête que vous concevez comme une autopsie. Hein, le mot autopsie sociale d'un désastre est un mot que vous utilisez dès la première version de 2002. Vous avez été une sorte de sociologue médecin légiste en quelque sorte, parce que ce que vous avez voulu faire, et je crois que c'est important de l'expliquer aux auditeurs, ce que vous avez voulu faire, c'est de sortir des visions simplistes des relations entre canicule, niveau social des quartiers et mortalité. Ce que vous avez découvert, ce sont en quelque sorte des anomalies, et j'aimerais que vous nous expliquiez un peu ces anomalies autour de cet exemple célèbre des deux quartiers proches de North and South Loudsdale, où finalement des quartiers très comparables, qui auraient dû avoir des mortalités comparables, dans le cadre d'une vision un peu déterministe, simple de la mortalité, eh bien, vous découvrez que leur comportement, leur résistance à l'endommagement est très différente, et c'est cela qui vous pousse à devenir le médecin légiste qui autopsie cette canicule.
Yes. Yes, Michelle, I will say there are a few puzzles that were really hard to understand that motivated this project. The first is that climate scientists and epidemiologists have models where they predict how much death there will be based on certain weather conditions. And the first big surprise is that the climate models predicted just a small fraction of the actual number of people who died in Chicago. So the first question is, why did so many more people die than the climate scientists predicted? You know, something happened socially. And the second thing is that, as you say, I saw all of these neighborhoods that were next to each other, you know, physically next to each other. And demographically, they looked almost the same, you know, the same poverty level, the same rate of people who are old and alone, same levels of segregation. And you would think that they would do just about the same in a heat wave, but actually there were incredible variations just when you cross the street from one neighborhood into another. And so I wanted to know, you know, how is that possible? Well, what's going on there? And the metaphor I used really in the beginning was that this would be like a social autopsy. And I want to talk about that concept because, you know, we have an incredible scientific technique for understanding death at the individual level. And it's the dominant one. And because we live in a world where biomedical explanations at the individual level tend to dominate, and that's, I think, especially true in the United States and maybe in England, but I think it's true in France as well. You know, why does someone die? It's because some organ broke down in their body. And the amazing technology we have is the autopsy of an individual, right? If someone dies and we can't understand what happened, we physically open up their body and we search inside the body for the cause of that individual's death. And I'll tell you, Michelle, when I started doing my research on the heat wave, I went to visit the medical examiner, the coroner in Chicago, to talk to him about their records. And I think to test me, he brought me down without telling me into a room in Chicago where they do the autopsies. So the beginning of the project was my first introduction to seeing bodies where the rib cages were opened and they were searching for organs. And it was quite a grisly sociological affair. And it occurred to me that what I wanted to do to understand these puzzles is to kind of go up several scales. And instead of looking at the individual, I wanted to understand, well, how and why does a city break down? And so imagine, if you can, you go above the sky, you know, go up into the sky above the skyscrapers and open up the skin of the city. You open up Chicago. And now, in the same way that a medical autopsy searches for a physiological organ, I want to look for the organs of the city, the big institutions, the things that structure city life, and see how they broke down. And that really became the technique for working out questions like, you know, why did people die alone? And why are some neighborhoods so much more deadly than others that look just like them?
Et c'est une manière d'ailleurs de dire aux futurs lecteurs que ce livre, et on reviendra ensuite à quelques-unes de ses conclusions majeures, ce livre est un livre de sciences sociales extrêmement rigoureux, centré sur de nombreuses observations et sur une production de données très importante. C'est-à-dire c'est un livre qui s'appuie véritablement dans la grande tradition de la sociologie urbaine américaine, sur une maîtrise impressionnante de données très nombreuses, à la fois des données quantitatives, mais aussi des données qualitatives, qui vont d'ailleurs parfois aussi jusqu'à des analyses d'images, hein, sur la façon dont la catastrophe a été mise en scène dans les médias, et que ce livre n'est pas du tout une enquête purement subjective de non-fiction autour d'un drame urbain, mais qu'il y a véritablement la volonté de faire science, hein, de faire de la canicule aussi un terrain d'épreuve pour la science sociale.
Yes, I mean, thank you for picking that up. I'm very respectful of the different techniques, you know, the different kinds of scientific techniques that we use to generate knowledge. It's an incredible thing, you know, if you think about it, that our science is as powerful as it is. But now, even consider where we are in the pandemic. I don't know if you've heard about this pandemic that we have in New York. Has it gotten to you in France yet, the pandemic?
Yes,
you know.
Yes.
No, I'm kidding. So if you think about the conversation about the pandemic, we still think of it as primarily a biophysical, biomedical event. You know, it's what are when we talk about the pre-existing conditions that make a person more vulnerable, we're talking about diabetes or obesity, right? Or age. Those are the pre-existing conditions that matter. But of course, if you scale up and you want to understand who's at risk and who's resilient, the pre-existing conditions that matter are social as well. And you can't explain, you know, why are there violent fights over mask wearing in the United States, you know, in the first months of the pandemic? Why are some people refusing the vaccine and others taking the vaccine? Why is there conservative medicine or liberal medicine? You can't understand that by understanding diabetes, you know, or obesity. You need to understand the social. And so in my book, what I try to do is establish the place where social science can really contribute to our understanding. Not to say that, you know, the other kinds of sciences are junk. They're not. We need them. In the case of the heat wave, I learned a lot from climate scientists. I learned a lot from epidemiologists. You know, I learned from many scientific fields, but I also could tell that the conversation about who's vulnerable in a heat wave and why and what systems work and don't, it can't just be about the weather. It can't just be about electricity. It can't just be about hospitals and medical care. There are all these things that need to be incorporated into the conversation. And, you know, I think what's so interesting is that, you know, I was writing this book in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, and we didn't really have a robust conversation about climate change at all. And so I'll tell you something funny, which is that in the first edition of the book, there's hardly a mention of global warming. And the reason is that when I was writing it, you know, I wrote this as a doctorant. I was still in school when I was working on the book at first. In fact, I wrote a lot of it as a chercheur invité at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, you know, where I worked for nearly a year. And the social scientists at the time said, you shouldn't write much about climate change because it's a theory. We don't really know what it means. It's outside of our area of expertise. So make sure that you're really just writing about the sociological things that you feel comfortable with. Don't put yourself at risk with this thing that we don't know about. And so I say a little bit about climate change towards the end of the book as a threat to be worried about, but it's not about climate change at first. But now think about where we are today. It would be impossible to write a book about a heat wave without making it primarily about global warming, right? Primarily about the Anthropocene. And so the framework for this, I think, works to help us understand the set of crises we're facing coming forward. It remains the case, for instance, that the hardest problems of the Anthropocene are no longer climate science problems. They're social and behavioral problems, right? I mean, that's really what we have to understand. How do we change social behavior to deal with this new world? But I didn't even know that I was doing that at the time. I was just trying to make sense of this phenomenon. And it still strikes me that it's urgent for everyone in the social sciences to think more explicitly about how living in the Anthropocene changes what we do, because the study of climate change is not just for environmental scientists. It's not even just for environmental sociologists. If you're doing any kind of research today, you're studying climate change.
Oui, je dois signaler aux futurs lecteurs et lectrices d'ailleurs que dans l'édition que nous publions en français et la deuxième édition de votre livre, agrémentée, augmentée d'une nouvelle préface que vous écrivez en 2015, une préface tout à fait passionnante dans laquelle justement vous revenez sur ces 13 années qui séparent la première édition de la deuxième, et vous mettez l'accent justement sur le fait qu'en 2015, la question du changement global et du réchauffement climatique devenait tout à fait centrale. Et de ce point de vue-là, la préface est aussi une pièce tout à fait intéressante pour qui s'intéresse à l'histoire des savoirs et à l'évolution des savoirs en fonction d'un certain nombre de nouvelles connaissances qui apparaissent dans des champs qui ne sont pas les champs de savoir de l'auteur, en l'occurrence les sciences du climat. Mais revenons à cette comparaison de quartiers proches. Il y a comme ça plusieurs paires de quartiers proches que vous étudiez dans le livre. Je laisse le lecteur les découvrir. Vous prenez donc des quartiers qui ont globalement les mêmes conditions urbaines. Des quartiers très comparables géosocialement. Et vous observez des différences de mortalité extrêmement spectaculaires. Vous prenez plutôt des quartiers qui sont des quartiers pauvres. Et vous voyez dans ces quartiers pauvres, certains avoir des mortalités très fortes et d'autres avoir des mortalités comparables à certains quartiers très riches et très équipés en climatisation d'autres fractions urbaines de Chicago. Et j'aimerais que vous nous expliquiez à quel type de conclusion vous arrivez. C'est-à-dire une conclusion qui est très intéressante et qui va être très intéressante pour vos travaux ultérieurs. C'est-à-dire, vous en venez à dire que finalement, ce qui explique cette différence, c'est quelque chose sans doute de plus global que de simples déterminants sociaux, quelque chose qui renverrait à l'urbanité, en quelque sorte, de ces quartiers, au fonctionnement des infrastructures sociales et communautaires de ces quartiers, c'est-à-dire un type de relation sociale, un type de relationnalité à l'intérieur de ces quartiers.
Yes. Yes, thank you for getting back to the meat of this story, because it's really fascinating for me. And you're right that this kind of discovery changed the future of my work. Certainly for the last 20 years, I've been working through the ramifications, the consequences of this discovery. And the discovery is this, that if you try to understand why there was so much variation across neighborhoods that were similar, again, I want to be very clear. It's not scientifically interesting to say that a wealthy neighborhood has a higher death or a lower death rate than a poor neighborhood. We know that. The comparison group was to find the poor neighborhoods in Chicago that had very similar demographics, that had the same risk factors, and understand variation inside of that set. That's much more interesting. It's much more challenging to do. And the normal things we look at, the quantitative data like poverty level or demographics of aging, they didn't really help to explain what happened. So I started to do ethnography. I went back to Chicago. I started walking in the streets and talking to people and observing daily routines to understand how different neighborhoods worked. And what I learned from spending time in them is that what mattered was what I've come to call the social infrastructure. The social infrastructure is the big concept that comes out of this work. And in fact, I recently wrote another book about it. It's called Palaces for the People. And when I say social infrastructure, I mean something very specific. I'm talking about the physical places and the organizations that shape our interactions. So the neighborhoods that had very high levels of death in Chicago, they weren't just poor, they weren't just segregated, they were depleted, they were abandoned. They had a lot of abandoned buildings, they had empty lots, the sidewalks were in bad shape. They did not have a lot of commercial life like coffee shops or grocery stores. The parks and playgrounds, they didn't have many, or those they had were in bad shape. The community organizations were fairly weak and had trouble to run programs. And if you live in a neighborhood with a depleted social infrastructure, your survival strategy is you stay home more often, or maybe you go to socialize outside of the neighborhood. And so if it's an extremely hot and dangerous day, nobody necessarily thinks I should go knock on Michelle's door, because they're not used to seeing Michelle spending time in the neighborhood on a daily basis. Everyone is kind of keeping to themselves, right? It's not because people don't care about you. Oftentimes when we talk about community, we talk about culture. Do people care for each other? Do they have the right values? But what I'm saying is it's not really about culture and values, because if you cross the street and you go to the neighborhood that's also poor, that's also segregated, but that has a robust sidewalk culture, that has coffee shops and grocery stores and small restaurants, a place that has parks and libraries and community organizations, if it's a rich social infrastructure, the physical places work, people are drawn out of their home and into public life, and you then socialize in public, or you don't have to have a long conversation, but you wave at a neighbor. Your neighbor sees you. And now if I am Michelle's neighbor and I see Michelle most days of the week, we just wave at each other. I see him walking, I see him sitting at the park bench. Now there's a dangerous condition, there's a dangerous weather system, and he's not there. I go to knock on his door because I can tell something is wrong. It's not because I care more. It's not because my values are more caring than the people who live in the next neighborhood. It's because the social infrastructure where I live supports social life that's more protective. And it turns out when I looked across sets of Chicago neighborhoods and found these matching pairs where the place here is poor and high death and the place here is poor and low death, I consistently found that difference. The places with rich social infrastructure were much more protective. And so that was a big surprise to people who hadn't even come, we didn't really have a vocabulary for thinking about that difference. And we've now looked at that difference across different kinds of crises and noted just how important social infrastructure is. And by the way, it matters for all variety of climate events, whether it's a heat wave or a hurricane, because places with a rich social infrastructure, help to generate support networks that we need to get through these crises. In the pandemic, you might be wondering, there's an interesting thing that happened, which is that at first, if you live in a place with a very active social life and a rich social infrastructure, there are actually slightly higher rates of transmission in the beginning of a pandemic. But as soon as people learned what made them at risk, then the rates went down, and it turns out, social distance is actually very dangerous in a pandemic because we need each other's support to get, groceries, to get pharmaceutical drugs, to get physical distance. We need, you can't go visit someone's home in the early days of a pandemic, but social proximity, social solidarity is crucial. And so over time, rich social infrastructure is even protective for people in a pandemic. And I think this helps us understand something fundamental about the interaction between the exogenous threat, whether it's climate or an infectious disease, and the urban fabric, and how these things really come together to shape our experience. Because of course, this, again, for climate as for COVID, it's not just the climate or COVID, it's the way that they collide with the social structures that we have at any given time, in any given place. It's the connection between the social fabric and the threat that really determine life and death.
Oui, ce que vous venez de dire est important aussi pour ceux qui nous écoutent, pour essayer de prouver, s'il en était encore besoin, que votre livre pose toute une série de questions qui sont en fait des questions fondamentales, à la fois pour la science sociale, mais aussi des questions politiques fondamentales. Par l'insistance que vous avez justement sur ces infrastructures sociales, on y reviendra. Mais ce qui est très frappant, et c'est ce que j'ai voulu expliquer pour les lecteurs français qui ne vous connaîtraient pas dans l'avant-propos que j'ai fait pour cette traduction française, c'est qu'on peut bien considérer, et vous l'avez dit tout à l'heure, que ce livre a été fondamental pour l'orientation de vos travaux de recherche ultérieurs jusqu'à 2022. C'est-à-dire que je suis frappé de voir que vos grands travaux sont, pour moi, directement lié à un certain nombre de conclusions ou un certain nombre d'observations que vous faites dans Heatwave. Vous écrivez un livre sur l'évolution des médias locaux aux États-Unis, qui peut paraître un peu loin de vos préoccupations actuelles, mais qui est en fait aussi un livre dont on trouve des échos dans Heatwave, puisque vous vous interrogez dans Heatwave sur les questions de médiatisation. Vous écrivez un livre sur la solitude, Going Solo, qui est un livre qui vient directement du constat que vous faites de l'importance de la mortalité des personnes isolées. Et vous développez une recherche spécifique pour comprendre la solitude urbaine. Et puis, vous l'avez évoqué, vous publiez un livre il y a quelques années, en 2018, Palaces for People, en reprenant la formule d'Andrew Carnegie, le milliardaire, désignant ainsi les milliardaires comme les bibliothèques, pardon, bâtons, comme des palais pour le peuple. Et en fait, ce livre est directement lié à votre réflexion sur les infrastructures sociales, puisque vous vous demandez dans quelles conditions on peut permettre à une société de tenir face à un désastre. Et enfin, dernière chose, nous nous rencontrons il y a un peu plus d'une dizaine d'années à New York à l'occasion d'un séminaire organisé autour de la question du désastre et de la catastrophe, parce que à partir de Heatwave, on peut dire que vous devenez aussi un penseur du désastre et de la catastrophe comme élément révélateur des fragilités urbaines et aussi un événement devant nous permettre de réfléchir à la façon d'organiser des villes plus robustes socialement et plus justes. Donc, partagez-vous mon analyse de ce lien entre Heatwave et l'ensemble de votre travail, et peut-être revenons aussi sur cette réflexion sur les infrastructures sociales qui me paraît vraiment tout à fait importante.
Yeah, yes, I think you would be a good psychoanalyst as well as a geographer. So I appreciate that. You're right. I mean, I think the questions that were on my mind when I tried to understand the heat wave were really deep questions. And I guess we could take a pause for a moment just to think about, where good social science comes from. And the role of theory in animating problems, because, and this is another French connection for me, to be honest, the kind of conventional work on this, maybe from the tradition of the Chicago School of Sociology, would have said, think about a heat wave event as an event that's about, community and social order and moral order and physical place. But there was a lot more going on with me at the time. I was thinking about this question of denial and our will not to know about these kinds of crises. It's really very striking that when the heat wave first hit, the impulse of many people in Chicago, including the mayor, was to say, this is not really real. That this is not really happening, and that there were a lot of people in the city who didn't want to think about it. But that all of these kind of classic sociological problems that some of what you've raised about isolation, about symbolic power and the role of the media in shaping our experience of the world, there's a chapter in the books about kind of the entrepreneurial state and neoliberalism, and this notion that individuals are responsible for themselves, and it's all very strikingly similar to what's happened in COVID in the last couple of years. These things came out, and so when I planned the social autopsy, I tried to do it in a very capacious way, and to think about these different problems that you raised. And so when I worked them out through the analysis of this event, this disaster, I thought I was able to explain more about what went wrong in Chicago, but I also realized that I had unearthed problems that I needed to think about much more. And so in a way, for the last 20 years, I have tried to follow each of those lines. Why are so many people living alone and dying alone? How did we create a world where, really for the first time in the history of our species, we have enormous numbers of people who are living alone for long periods of time? Really, for 200,000 years, that was never the case. And now it's quite common, more common in France than in the US, for people to live by themselves. And that's really an extraordinary change that sociologists hadn't understood. I wanted to understand, something about social infrastructure and how cities work. I wanted to understand how the media ecosystem had changed. And so I've kind of pulled out of these areas for books that treat the issue on their own. Now, I should tell you, maybe you figured this out already from the way I'm talking, but I'm in the middle of doing this social autopsy of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is really like writing Heatwave on a global scale. And it's a little bit overwhelming, I have to tell you. If you see, bags under my eyes, if I look a little tired, it's because it's really a lot of work to do this. But I still believe that the world has not come to appreciate the power of social science for helping us understand where we are. the value of sociology for helping generate crucial knowledge we need to do things like, manage the pandemic or deal with life in the Anthropocene. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, the director of the National Institute for Health in the United States, which is one of the largest scientific bodies in the world, said, we really misunderstood how important social and behavioral sciences are for making sense of the pandemic. And we probably would have done a much better job if we had invested more in social and behavioral sciences. And in a way, I think of this COVID pandemic as a kind of dress rehearsal for the problem of the Anthropocene, which will of course be, significantly more complex and require different kinds of behavior changes that are long lasting and coordinated around the world, because there's not going to be a vaccine for global warming. And so the challenges will be much more acute. And so the last thing I'll say is that while it's true that I'm doing all these different kinds of things, what I've also learned is just how important it is to have teams that can do these things collaboratively, which is why it's so exciting that there's, you've kind of been assembling this group in Lyon to do this work, and why I think it's so important for us to be collaborating on an international scale, because you can't solve the problem by looking just at France or just at the United States. This is really an interconnected situation.
Les conclusions que vous tirez de ce livre sur Chicago sont aussi des conclusions qui motivent bien sûr votre travail scientifique, mais aussi votre engagement dans le siècle, parce que je pense, moi, de mon point de vue français, que vous êtes un sociologue impliqué dans la démocratie américaine et dans la réflexion sur l'évolution de cette démocratie. J'en citerai deux exemples. Vous essayez de promouvoir véritablement, en tant qu'universitaire, une action de prise en compte réelle du changement global dans les cursus universitaires de sciences sociales, c'est-à-dire vous essayez de faire en sorte que la formation change en raison même du global warming et de tout ce que cela comporte, c'est-à-dire vous essayez de prôner une capacité collective de s'adapter au changement global à partir d'une évolution de la formation, et ça n'est pas si simple parce que le monde académique est ainsi fait qu'il est engoncé dans ses routines. Et puis dans un autre domaine, vous aviez accepté la proposition du président Obama de prendre la responsabilité scientifique d'une structure créée pour essayer de reconstruire des zones endommagées après l'ouragan Sandy, de façon que finalement la reconstruction ne soit pas simplement une simple remise en état, mais un moyen aussi de faire progresser la société. Et cela vous mène aussi à avoir, y compris dans votre dernier livre, Policies for People, et dans la presse, des positions très fortes contre la privatisation des infrastructures sociales, c'est-à-dire contre le fait, vous l'avez signalé tout à l'heure, que depuis 40 ans, les politiques publiques ont de plus en plus concédé aux entrepreneurs privés la gestion des infrastructures sociales, alors même que le citoyen était lui-même considéré de plus en plus comme l'entrepreneur de sa propre vie, devant simplement viser sa réussite personnelle. Donc vous prenez quand même des positions qui sont des positions, dans le contexte nord-américain, des positions très radicales en un sens, en tout cas très, très engagées. Et je pense qu'il est bon de terminer cet entretien, le temps passe trop vite, Eric, en évoquant cet aspect aussi de votre travail.
Yes, well, the social sciences are very professionalized in the United States, of course, and we have less of a tradition of public intellectual engagement from fields like sociology. We have a tendency historically to be a little more technocratic and a little less engaged in political struggles on the ground. And here again, the fact that so much of my training was in France, and a lot of it happened in the late 1990s, in the in the stage of Pierre Bourdieu's career, where he was very public-facing and very politically engaged in this kind of fight about neoliberalism. I think I was very inspired by the possibilities that I observed. Coming to France, I learned that there was a different way to practice sociology. And so I brought that back to the United States with me, and it really has stayed ever since. I think it's never really made a lot of sense to me to just do what we call ivory tower science, to only speak to scientists. It seems to me like sociology should be able to engage problems in the world in a useful way and change the way we see things as well as the way we react to things. But it's especially true for something like climate change and the Anthropocene. I mean, it just does not make any sense when you're dealing with an urgent problem that needs to be addressed within a span of some number of years before things really get so impossibly difficult that there's not much we can do. This is a moment where there's real urgency. And so, through my work with the Obama administration and also as the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge and as a writer who does more public-facing writing these days, I've really made it a mission of mine to kind of have my work animated by this civic spirit, this spirit of public engagement. And of course, now in the United States, in addition to the urgent problem of climate change, we are really facing a fundamental threat to our democratic culture. And we are really facing some real threats around racial injustice and inequality. And they all come together. They're not disconnected, these problems. And they played out in the pandemic, just as you might have expected. So, I really do respect my colleagues who are more technocratic and whose work really does kind of conventional science, moving the needle forward on all kinds of questions. That work is essential. But I don't think this is a moment for scientists to just be in back rooms discussing things with each other. I don't know how you feel about this, Michelle, but it's really the first time in my life where it feels like everything is up for grabs. Everything is in the air. If you told me that in 5 years, America would be authoritarian and the fundamentals of our democracy would be torn apart and that we would be on a runaway course for catastrophic climate change, that would make sense to me. But also, if you told me that in 5 years, we will have defended democracy and we would be in the beginning of a Green New Deal that was true for the United States, but expanding into Europe and other parts of the world, that also makes sense to me. That also seems like a very plausible possibility. And so for me, what that means is that what we do right now matters, maybe more than at any other time in our lives. What happens in this moment, this year, the next few years, it has incredible significance. And so, the burden of being alive at this moment is that it's incredibly stressful and difficult and hard. And we're a little less happy than we were a few years ago when we were just taking airplanes everywhere and eating lots of red meat. It's harder now. We're aware of these problems. There's risks around us. That's a terrible burden, but the burden comes with this incredible opportunity, which is that we are the people in the history of our species who are going to make the most important decisions about where we go next and how we're going to inhabit this planet together. And so it seems to me like it's just crucial for us to be aware of that fact and to commit ourselves to a kind of public engagement that the moment requires.
Je pense, cher Eric, que ce sont de magnifiques mots pour terminer cette conversation qui pourrait durer bien plus longtemps. Je partage votre point de vue sur l'incertitude dans les 5 prochaines années. C'est aussi ce sentiment de l'urgence d'agir qui nous a poussé à traduire ce livre, Heatwave, que je remontre à la caméra, parce que je pense qu'il pose dès 2002 toute une série de questions dont nous ne sommes pas sortis. Et vous l'avez dit d'ailleurs dans une émission de radio que vous avez enregistré pour RFI. Je crois que rétrospectivement, depuis 20 ans, on aurait sans doute pu agir. Hein, on aurait pu ne serait-ce que lire les conclusions de ce livre et se poser un certain nombre de questions sur la canicule. Il y a un peu d'ironie à tenir ce propos aujourd'hui, alors que je crois que New York vient d'essuyer une des pires tempêtes de neige de ces années récentes, et que vous-même, vous êtes dans la neige jusqu'au cou à Brooklyn, je crois savoir. Voilà. Donc, le dérèglement climatique, c'est aussi quelque chose qui nous concerne tous et toutes. Et puis, je dois dire que si tout va bien, si la pandémie le permet, vous serez en France dans quelques semaines, dans 2 ou 3 petites semaines, pour rencontrer les lecteurs autour de Heatwave. Et si tout va bien, nous aurons le plaisir de vous accueillir à Lyon pour une autre discussion autour de Heatwave, et ça sera avec grand plaisir. D'ici là, je conseille à toutes les personnes qui nous écoutent de se précipiter pour acheter Canicule, qui est présent sur le stand de la librairie qui est à l'entrée de cet amphithéâtre. Et cher Eric, merci beaucoup d'avoir été là ce matin à New York et cet après-midi en France. Et je te dis à très bientôt, Eric, et merci aussi de cette confiance que tu nous as faite pour que l'on puisse traduire ce livre. À tout bientôt.
Merci, à très bientôt.